The Galactic Council threatened humanity with war, Earth responded with cheers. The vote was already happening when I walked into the chamber. I was not supposed to be there. My clearance badge said, Observer pending confirmation, which meant I was technically a warm body with a lanyard, standing near the back wall of a room that smelled like ozone and something older than recorded history. The chamber of the Galactic Council was not built for human eyes. It was built for species that measured time in centuries and spoke in frequencies we needed machines to hear. Every surface curved slightly inward, as if the room itself was leaning toward whatever sat at the center. 7 raised platforms, 7 delegations, 7 alien civilizations that had been running the known galaxy long before our ancestors figured out fire. I was Maravas. 29 years old. Earth's first xenodiplomatic liaison, appointed 6 weeks ago in what my supervisor called a historic moment, and what I called a sign that everyone more qualified said no. I had studied alien linguistics for 8 years. I had trained in zero-gravity protocol, cultural sensitivity across 14 species, and the specific art of not showing surprise when something with 17 legs offered you a greeting. I was supposed to be ready for this. I was not ready for this. The eminence was already speaking when I found my position near the rear observation rail. It was the Council's chief arbiter, a being made entirely of something between glass and ice, about 3 meters tall, with a voice that didn't travel through air so much as bypass it completely and arrive directly behind your back teeth. When it spoke, you felt it more than heard it. It was reading charges. I activated my translation earpiece and caught the tail end, persistent violation of the outer spiral accord, unsanctioned atmospheric modification of 14 registered bodies, and the repeated and deliberate disregard of Council directives issued across a period of 11 galactic cycles. It paused. The chamber was perfectly still. The species designated Earth origin humanity, Catalog Reference 7741, is hereby formally charged. My hand moved to my comm badge on instinct. I pressed it once, which opened a live channel back to Mission Control in Geneva. They were monitoring in real time. 43 people in a basement on Earth, watching the same feed I was watching, listening to the same voice I was trying very hard not to visibly react to. The eminence continued. Its crystal facets caught the light as it turned, slowly, scanning each delegation in sequence before settling on the small human observation section, which was me, one nervous translator named Owen Graves who kept clicking his pen, and our diplomatic attaché, a calm, silver-haired woman named Carol Price who had spent 30 years in international relations and apparently used up all her fear reserves by the age of 50. The Council has deliberated, the eminence said, and reached a unanimous position. That was not true. I had read the pre-session briefs. 2 delegations had significant internal disagreement. But I said nothing. Earth origin humanity is granted 30 galactic cycles, equivalent to approximately 92 of their planetary rotations, to cease all interstellar operations beyond their home system. All vessels currently operating beyond the boundary are to be recalled. All terraforming operations are to be suspended. All contact with non-Council species in the outer spiral is to be terminated. Owen stopped clicking his pen. Carol Price did not move. I kept my face completely neutral, which cost me a significant amount of energy. The eminence's voice dropped half a register. Failure to comply will be interpreted as a declaration of hostility. The Council's collective response will be swift, total, and permanent. This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. This is the final warning that will be issued. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. I pressed my comm badge twice, the signal for transmission complete, awaiting response. Then I stood there, in the curved and leaning room, surrounded by 7 species that had never once in their long history been told no by anyone, and I waited. The response from Earth took 4 seconds. In diplomatic terms, 4 seconds is nothing. In human terms, 4 seconds is enough time for a person to decide whether to laugh or cry. I had expected noise, the controlled, tense murmur of a war cabinet absorbing bad news. I had expected the clipped, careful voice of Director Harlan Cole telling me to hold my position and say nothing. What came through was not that. It was loud. It was chaotic in the way that crowds are chaotic, layered and uneven and alive with a kind of energy that has no single source. There were voices in it, not 1 or 2 but dozens, all talking over each other. And underneath all of it, rising up through the static of a bad interstellar relay, was a sound that I had heard at football matches and rocket launches and the moment a city learns its team has won something important. It was cheering. Not polite applause. Not relieved exhaling. Actual, unambiguous, human cheering, the kind that starts in the chest and has nowhere to go but out. It took me 4 full seconds to understand what I was hearing. My brain kept trying to replace it with something that made more sense. Alarm klaxons. Shouted orders. The sound of a government learning it might be going to war with 7 alien civilizations. Instead, cheering. Carol Price leaned slightly toward me. Her voice was perfectly quiet, perfectly level. "It appears," she said, "that Earth has received the message." I looked at the eminence. It was watching our section with an expression I had no reference for, not in any of the 8 years of training, not in any of the 14 cultural briefings. Its facets had shifted into a configuration that my instincts read as confusion, but I wasn't certain. I wasn't certain about anything in that moment except one thing. Whatever the council had expected to happen when it delivered that ultimatum, this was not it. Owen slowly put his pen in his pocket. Director Cole's voice finally came through, sharp and steady under the noise. "Mara. You are instructed to acknowledge receipt of the council's position, request a formal recess of no less than 5 cycles for Earth to prepare its official diplomatic response, and under no circumstances show them what's happening on this end of the line." I straightened my jacket. I stepped forward. I put on my most composed, professionally neutral expression, the one I had practiced in a mirror for 2 months. "On behalf of the government and people of Earth," I said clearly, in the Council's standard diplomatic dialect, "I acknowledge receipt of the Council's formal position. We respectfully request a recess of 5 cycles to allow for the preparation of Earth's official response." The eminence looked at me for a long moment. Behind me, faintly, through the still open comm line, I could hear the cheering. I kept my face perfectly still. 5 cycles are granted," the eminence said slowly. "The Council expects Earth's response to reflect the gravity of its position." "Of course," I said. I turned and walked back to Carol Price and Owen Graves, and the 3 of us moved toward the chamber exit with measured, unhurried steps, and I did not allow myself to feel anything until the door closed behind us. Then Owen looked at me and said, very quietly, "Were they cheering?" "Yes," I said. He blinked. "Why?" he asked. I thought about it. I thought about every mission briefing I had read, every historical file, every account of what humans had come through in the last 100 years before we ever looked at the stars and decided they were worth reaching for. I thought about the sound that a species makes when it has been waiting a very long time for the universe to finally take notice. "I think," I said, "that's what we do." The first encrypted briefing arrived 40 minutes after the recess was called, delivered through a military-grade relay that bounced the signal across 3 deep space buoys before it reached my personal terminal in the observer quarters of Station Argos 7. I read it standing up, still in my diplomatic jacket, with a cup of tea going cold on the desk beside me. The file was marked with Director Cole's personal authorization code and the designation, Eyes Only, VOS, M. It was 11 pages long. I read it twice. Then I sat down, picked up the cold tea, and stared at the wall for about 3 minutes, because the document required some sitting with. The short version was this: Earth had known this moment was coming for approximately 4 years. Not the specifics, not the exact date or the chamber or the crystal-voiced arbiter reading charges in a room designed to reduce visitors to silence. But the broad shape of it. The Council had been watching humanity's expansion into the outer spiral with increasing discomfort for nearly a decade, and Earth's intelligence network, built quietly and carefully through a combination of diplomatic back channels, long-range sensor arrays, and the dedicated work of people whose names I was not cleared to know, had been monitoring that discomfort and modeling its trajectory. The models had been right. The Council threatened. Earth cheered. And the cheering, I now understood, was not accidental. I set down the tea and kept reading. The second page was a strategic summary prepared by Admiral Nora Finch of Earth's Combined Space Command. Admiral Finch was 61 years old, had spent 35 of those years in deep space operations, and was described in her official biography as direct. Her summary lived up to that description. She wrote, "The Council's collective military capacity is significant on paper. 7 species, combined fleet tonnage of approximately 40,000 vessels, operational range covering 80% of the charted galaxy. On any standard threat matrix, this is a serious adversary. However, standard threat matrices were not designed with humanity in mind, and more critically, they were not designed with the Council's operational history in mind either. In 11,000 years of recorded Council military action, they have never once engaged a species that did not capitulate before the first shot was fired. Their military apparatus is optimized for the delivery of threats, not the execution of them. They are, in the most precise strategic sense, a paper fleet. I paused there. Admiral Finch was not a person known for overconfidence. She was known, specifically, for the opposite, for a thoroughness so aggressive that her subordinates reportedly nicknamed her twice over. If she was calling the Council's fleet a paper fleet, she had done the maths. I kept reading. Page 3 explained the simulations. Earth's Wargaming Division had run the scenario 11,000 times over 14 months, varying the parameters across every combination of fleet deployment, tactical approach, and Council coordination that their models could produce. The results, Admiral Finch noted, were consistent across 93% of simulations. The Council's fundamental weakness was not firepower. It was the thing that had made them so powerful for so long, they had never needed to adapt. Every species they had ever confronted had given in before the conflict reached its second stage. As a result, their tactical doctrine had not meaningfully evolved in over 2,000 years. Humanity, on the other hand, had spent the last century doing almost nothing but adapting. The briefing document didn't romanticize this. It was clinical about it. Earth had nearly ended itself 3 times in the last 100 years: resource collapse, atmospheric crisis, a period of such severe internal fracture that entire regions had gone dark from the rest of the world for years at a time. What had come out the other side was not a civilization made soft by peace. It was a civilization that had been stress-tested to the edge of its own survival and had come back smaller, quieter, and significantly more difficult to frighten. I thought about the cheering again. It made more sense now. I moved to page 4, which was a psychological assessment prepared by Dr. Lena Ward, lead analyst at the Earth Diplomatic Intelligence Bureau. Dr. Ward had spent her career studying interspecies conflict and its preconditions. Her section was titled, simply, Why They Miscalculated. She wrote, "The Council's error is consistent with a pattern observed across every species that has underestimated humanity. They assessed our capacity based on our technology, our fleet size, and our diplomatic history, all of which, taken in isolation, suggest a civilization that should be manageable. What they did not assess, because they had no framework for assessing it, is the human psychological response to threat. In the majority of species catalogued by the Council, existential threat triggers submission behavior. Resources are calculated, odds are weighed, and survival instinct overrides pride. In humanity, existential threat has historically triggered something closer to the opposite. We have a cultural and neurological tendency to treat the thing that threatens to end us as the most interesting problem we have ever been given. The Council issued a warning designed to produce fear. It produced excitement. These are not the same thing. I read that paragraph 3 times. It was the most accurate description of something I had felt but never been able to name. The 5th page was a technical briefing from Commander Paul Dre of the Earth Engineering Corps. It described, in careful detail, what Earth had been doing for the past 14 months, quietly, without announcement, while the Council's surveillance drones watched from a distance and reported that humanity seemed to be continuing normal operations. Which was true. Humanity was continuing normal operations. It was simply also doing other things at the same time. Deep space manufacturing platforms had shifted roughly 30% of their output capacity. Not away from civilian projects, alongside them. New propulsion research had been accelerated. A class of vessel that the public knew about as long-range survey ships had been refitted with systems that were not, technically, survey-related. None of this had been hidden. Earth had not tried to hide it. It had simply done it openly, the way you move furniture in your own house, not sneaking, not announcing, just doing the thing. Commander Dre noted, the Council's surveillance infrastructure is optimized to detect concealment. It is not optimized to detect transparency. By conducting all activity in plain sight and without announcement, we have effectively been invisible to their threat assessment systems, which are trained to look for things being hidden. I put the document down and looked at the ceiling. Outside my window, Station Argos 7 hummed with the sound of 7 civilizations going about the business of being old and powerful and certain of themselves. The eminence was presumably in its private chambers, processing the unexpected request for a 5-cycle recess from the species it had just threatened with total elimination. I thought about what Director Cole had said: hold your position, say nothing, don't show them what's happening on this end of the line. What was happening on this end of the line, I now understood, was the following: Earth had spent 4 years quietly, cheerfully, and with great enthusiasm preparing for exactly this conversation. And when the conversation finally arrived, in the form of an ultimatum delivered by a crystal giant in a curved room on a space station 40 light-years from home, the reaction of the people who had done all that preparing was not fear. It was the sound a person makes when they have been waiting a very long time to show someone what they have been working on. My comm badge chimed. It was Carol Price. "Mara," she said, "there's a council aide outside your door. Name's Drivos, attached to the Velhari delegation. He says he would like a private word." I picked up the briefing document and locked it in the desk drawer. "Send him in," I said. Drivos was small, even by Velhari standards, about the height of a tall Earth child, with dark green scales that had faded slightly at the edges, the way old wood fades. He had worked for the council for what he told me was 40 of your years, in a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who had spent 4 decades being careful about every word they said. He stood near the door, not entering fully, and looked at me with eyes that were amber and very still. "I want to warn you," he said, in careful standard dialect, "about what you are facing." "I appreciate that," I said. "Your people are not afraid," he said. It was not a compliment. It sounded more like a diagnosis. "No," I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I have served this council for 40 years. I have watched them deliver this message to 9 different species." He paused. All 9 complied. "I know," I said. "They do not have a procedure for the alternative," he said. "That is not a comfort. That is a danger. The absence of a procedure does not mean the absence of a response. It means the response will be improvised. And improvised responses from frightened powers are not predictable." He held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, turned, and walked out. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened my comm to Mission Control and requested a full strategy briefing for the following morning. Because Drivos was right that there was danger here. But he was also missing something. Something that Dr. Ward had been circling in her assessment and Admiral Finch had been building toward in her simulations. Something that 30 cycles of negotiation were about to make very clear to the 7 oldest civilizations in the known galaxy. Unpredictable responses go both ways. The first real session began on Cycle 3. I walked into the formal negotiation chamber at precisely the scheduled hour, carrying a sealed case of documents that weighed about 2 kilograms and represented, in aggregate, about 400 years of human diplomatic thought. Behind me came Carol Price, who had slept 4 hours and showed no sign of it, and Owen Graves, who had prepared 63 pages of linguistic notes and was visibly thrilled about all of them. The council had sent 7 representatives. Each one was seated at the arc of the central table, the same curved, inward-leaning design as the main chamber, the same subtle architectural trick of making visitors feel like the room was gently, inexorably folding around them. I had noticed, by Cycle 2, that the trick stopped working once you knew about it. The room tried to make you feel small and it could not make you feel something you had decided not to feel. The eminence was not present for this session. It had sent a designated arbiter, a species I had not encountered before, called the Soren, tall and narrow with elongated features and the habit of tilting their head approximately 15 degrees to the right when they were listening. This one's name translated roughly as Voice of the Third Chamber, which I privately shortened to just Third because life is short. Third opened the session with a prepared statement outlining the council's position. The statement was long, formal, and communicated, essentially, one thing: comply. Carol Price nodded politely through all of it. When Third finished, there was the expected pause, the space in which, in every prior council ultimatum, the threatened party had either wept or begun listing the terms of their capitulation. Carol opened her document case. She removed a sealed folder, broke the tab, and set the first page on the table in front of her. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "Earth has prepared its formal response." Third tilted its head 15 degrees. "Earth welcomes the Council's engagement," Carol began, in a tone that I can only describe as warmly professional. "The the tone of a person who has chaired hundreds of difficult meetings and found them all, ultimately, manageable. We acknowledge the concerns raised regarding the outer spiral operations and are prepared to discuss each item in substantive detail. In parallel, Earth wishes to table a formal counterproposal, which we believe addresses the Council's underlying interests while preserving humanity's operational continuity. Third said nothing. We have provided full documentation, Carol continued, sliding a second folder across the table. Including the relevant survey data from the 14 atmospheric modification sites, which we believe the Council's briefings may have characterized in ways that don't fully reflect the technical methodology. The Soren representative looked at the folder. Then at Carol. Then at me. Then back at Carol. You are not withdrawing, Third said. We are negotiating, Carol said, with the same pleasant steadiness. The Council did not offer negotiation. No, Carol agreed. But Earth is offering it. And in our experience, negotiation tends to produce better outcomes than the alternative, for everyone involved. Third tilted its head the other way, which I had not seen it do before. I made a note. What followed was 4 hours of the most unusual diplomatic exchange I had ever witnessed, and I had witnessed, in my training simulations, exchanges across 11 different species and 3 active interstellar disputes. The Council's representatives were experienced, precise, and operating from a framework that had functioned without failure for 11,000 years. They knew how to apply pressure. They knew how to signal consequence. They knew how to make a species feel the full weight of the forces being brought to bear against it. What they did not know how to do was negotiate with someone who was not frightened. It changes everything, that absence of fear. Not because it makes one side aggressive or reckless, Carol Price was neither. It makes one side honest. When you are not afraid of the worst-case outcome, you have no reason to be dishonest about what you want or what you will accept. You simply say what you mean. You make your case clearly, you listen carefully to the other side, and when you disagree you say so without dressing it up. This, for the Council's representatives, was deeply unsettling. There was a moment in the second hour when the Dorvani delegate, a broad, heavily built species known for their particular effectiveness at communicating displeasure, produced what I later learned was a traditional ceremonial gesture meaning the weight of what comes next. Every species present understood it. In 11,000 years of Council proceedings, no species on the receiving end of the gesture had continued the conversation. They had all, at that point, submitted. Carol looked at the gesture carefully, with genuine interest. Then she said, I'm not familiar with that one. Could you walk me through what you'd like us to understand from it? The Dorvani delegate did not respond for several seconds. Owen, sitting beside me, wrote something in his notes and underlined it twice. Earth, meanwhile, was not standing still. The briefings that arrived each morning on my secure terminal showed a picture that I found both reassuring and quietly staggering. Earth's deep space assets were in motion, not retreating, not massing for a dramatic show of force, but repositioning with the kind of calm efficiency that speaks of people who have planned for exactly this and are simply executing the plan. Survey ships moved to new coordinates. Manufacturing platforms adjusted their output. Supply lines that had been running through Council-monitored corridors were quietly rerouted through paths the Council's sensors covered less thoroughly. And all of it was done openly. Commander Dre had been right. The Council looked for hidden things. Open things, done without announcement, in plain sight, registered in their systems as routine. 30,000 decisions that individually looked like maintenance or adjustment or normal operational shift, and collectively constituted a complete rearrangement of Earth's strategic posture. By cycle 12, the Council had run 17 internal reviews trying to identify what Earth was concealing. Each review came back with the same answer: nothing. Earth was concealing nothing. Earth was simply doing things. That, Admiral Finch had noted in a follow-up brief, is the thing they cannot model. In the negotiation chamber, the sessions continued. I translated. I watched. I learned the specific shade of stillness that meant a Council delegate was processing something unexpected. I watched Third tilt its head 17 times in a single session, which I came to understand meant sustained cognitive revision. The being was, in real time, updating its models of what humanity was. On cycle 14, the Velhari delegate, a small, reserved being named something that translated loosely as first of this cycle, which I shortened to first, arrived at the session 12 minutes early and sat quietly at the table before anyone else was present. I was already there, reviewing notes. We were alone. You are adapting to us, first said, without preamble. We try to, I said. The others are not adapting to you, first said. I didn't answer that. They will, first said, quietly. Eventually. But they will not enjoy it. It was the most forthcoming any council delegate had been in 14 cycles. I filed it carefully. On cycle 19, Earth delivered its counterproposal. It was 904 pages long, precisely sourced, exhaustively detailed, and structured around a central offer that was, at its core, shockingly simple: not a ceasefire, not a withdrawal, not the slow retreat of a frightened power giving ground to save itself. A full partnership offer. A structured framework for shared governance of the outer spiral, joint development rights, mutual aid provisions, and a permanent diplomatic mechanism that would give humanity a formal seat at the council table. The council did not have a form for this. Third received the document, scanned the summary page, and then looked up at Carol with the head tilt that I had come to read as maximum processing load. This assumes equality of standing, Third said. Yes, Carol said. Earth does not have equality of standing. Not yet, Carol said, pleasantly. That's what the proposal is for. That night, in my quarters, I received a message from Drivos. It was brief. It said, "They are beginning to be afraid of you. This is different from the previous situation. Be careful." I thought about Dr. Ward's assessment. About the Council's 11,000 years of unopposed authority. About what it must feel like, from the inside, to be the most powerful force in the known galaxy and suddenly find yourself in a room with something that does not respond the way anything has ever responded before. I thought about what Carol had said, at the end of our first session, when I asked her how she stayed so calm. "I've been in rooms where people were angry because they were afraid," she said. "And I've been in rooms where people were afraid because they were angry." The Council is moving from one to the other. The second kind is harder, but it's also more honest. You can work with honest. 11 cycles left. The chamber kept leaning inward, trying to make us feel small. We kept not feeling it. Cycle 30 arrived the way final things always do, not with a dramatic entrance, but with the quiet, definitive arrival of a date on a calendar that has been marked for a long time. I woke at 0400 station time, which put me 90 minutes ahead of the scheduled session. I lay in the dark for a while, staring at the ceiling of my quarters on station Argos 7, doing the arithmetic that I had already done 50 times in the past week. It did not change. The Council's war resolution required a supermajority. 5 of 7 delegations voting in favor. For 11,000 years, this had been a formality. When the Council voted for enforcement action, all 7 voted yes. The unanimity was part of the point. The message it sent was, there is no crack here, no appeal, no dissent. It is one voice. For 30 cycles, I had been watching that unanimity very carefully. I got up, dressed in my formal diplomatic jacket, and walked to the observation deck to watch the stars for a while. They looked the same as they always looked. It occurred to me that they had been there for billions of years and had watched a great number of things play out beneath them, and they would continue to look more or less the same regardless of what happened in the next several hours. I found that thought reasonably comforting. The chamber was full when I arrived at 0530. Not just the 7 delegations, every seat in the observer gallery was occupied, which meant representatives from 43 non-council species had come to watch. Word had spread. Something was happening that had not happened before, and the wider galactic community, which generally kept its head down around council proceedings, had apparently decided it wanted to see this particular session with its own eyes. Carol Price was already at the human delegation table, perfectly composed, with a single notepad in front of her and a cup of something that steamed faintly. Owen was to her left, looking alert in the way that people look when they have had too much caffeine and are suppressing the evidence. I took my position at the translation station and activated my earpiece. The eminence entered at precisely 0600. I had seen it many times by this point, but it was always a moment. 3 meters of something between glass and ice, moving with a deliberateness that made the room feel like it was slowing down around it. It took its place at the apex of the arc, the highest point in the chamber, and looked out over the assembled delegations in silence for a long moment. Then it spoke. 30 cycles have elapsed, it said, in the voice that arrived behind your back teeth. Earth origin humanity has been given the prescribed time to respond to the Council's formal position. The Council will now receive Earth's final declaration of compliance. There was, in those words, no possibility of an alternative. The phrasing assumed the outcome. The compliance was expected, waiting to be received, a formality to be processed. Carol Price stood up. Every head in the chamber turned toward her. 43 species in the gallery, 7 delegations at the Ark, the eminence at the apex, all watching a silver-haired human woman in a diplomatic jacket stand up at a small table near the edge of the room. The government and people of Earth, Carol said clearly, respectfully declined to comply. The silence that followed that sentence was unlike any silence I had encountered. It was not the silence of a pause or a transition. It was the silence of a room full of beings that had just experienced something their understanding of the universe did not account for. It was the silence of 11,000 years of history encountering a sentence it had no reference for. The eminence did not move for 4 full seconds. Earth declines, it said finally, and the confusion in its voice was so alien to its usual certainty that the words sounded strange coming from it, like a word spoken in the wrong language. Respectfully, yes, Carol said. And reiterates its standing offer of partnership, the terms of which were submitted in full documentation on Cycle 19. Third tilted its head to an angle I had not seen before. The Dorvani delegate made a sound that my translation system rendered as, "This input is not recognized." Then the eminence said the words that opened the floor to the formal vote. The procedure was old. Older than most of the member species' written languages. The eminence would call each delegation. The delegation would declare. 5 of 7 was the threshold. The outcome, in theory, was not in question. In theory. The delegation of Soren, the eminence said. Enforcement. The word came immediately, clipped and formal. The delegation of Dorvani. Enforcement. The Dorvani delegate had recovered its certainty. 2 for 5. The delegation of Marin. A pause. Longer than any pause in the previous 2 declarations. The Marin delegation abstains. A sound moved through the gallery. Not loud, not dramatic, more like the sound of a collective intake of breath held very carefully. The eminence did not acknowledge the sound. The delegation of Torval. The Torval were the longest-standing council member, their membership predating all others by several thousand years. Their delegate was a vast, dark presence at the far end of the Ark, and when they spoke it was always with a weight that matched their history. The Torval delegation abstains. Now the gallery was not quiet. The sound that moved through it was the sound of 43 species processing something simultaneously. It was uneven and multilayered and very human in its chaos, except that it was not human at all. It was the response of civilizations that had long understood the Council to be a fixed point, and were watching that fixed point move. 3 delegations remaining. The Council needed 3 more votes for enforcement. 2 abstentions meant they had 2. The delegation of Seth. Enforcement. 4 of 5 needed. 1 delegation remaining after this vote. 1 more enforcement vote would trigger it. 1 abstention would not be enough to stop it. The delegation of Pyarth. I held very still. The Pyarth delegate was small and pale and had not spoken once in 30 cycles of sessions. In every briefing I had read, the Pyarth were described as reliable council supporters. Consistent. Predictable. The Pyarth delegation abstains. The noise in the gallery was no longer a collective intake of breath. It was the sound of something breaking open, not destructively, but the way a sealed room breaks open when someone finally finds the door. For enforcement votes. 3 abstentions. The resolution needed 5. The eminence was still. Absolutely still, in the way that suggested the being inside the crystal exterior was processing faster than the exterior was prepared to show. The delegation of Velhari, it said. First, the small, pale-scaled delegate who had arrived early to an empty room on Cycle 14 and said, "They will not enjoy it," stood up. I had a translation earpiece. I understood every syllable of what first said next. The Eminence, whose linguistic database was vast but notably incomplete in its coverage of the Velhari's older ceremonial registers, did not. First spoke for about 30 seconds in that older register. I did not translate it aloud for the chamber, as I had not been asked to. I wrote it down in my notes, every word. Then first sat. The Velhari vote is registered as, the Eminence paused for a fraction of a second. Opposition to enforcement. 4 votes for enforcement. 4 abstentions or opposition. The resolution had failed. It had never failed. In 11,000 years of recorded council history, an enforcement resolution had never failed. The procedure existed, the threshold existed, the mechanism for failure existed, but it had never been used. It was the door that no one had ever needed to open because no one had ever tried it. The Eminence stood at the apex of the chamber, in the silence that followed, and for the first time since I had arrived on Station Argos 7, it looked like something other than the fixed center of the known galaxy. It looked like a being standing in unfamiliar territory, without a map. I opened my comm badge to Earth. I said nothing. I simply opened the channel. And the cheering came through, the same cheering that had come through on Cycle 1, the same broad and layered sound of a people that had been waiting a long time for the thing that had just happened. Except this time I understood it. I had understood it since page 4 of Admiral Finch's brief, since Dr. Ward's assessment of what existential threat does to a species that has already survived more than it was supposed to. Since Carol Price had said, "You can work with honest," in a quiet corridor on Cycle 1. The cheering was not triumph. It was recognition. The sound a person makes when the thing they bet on comes through. The Eminence looked at our table. I kept my comm open, and I did not try to hide the sound. Carol Price was already writing. She tore the page from her notepad, folded it once, and passed it across the table to Third, who sat frozen in a maximum tilt that showed no sign of resolving. Third unfolded the paper. Looked at it. Passed it to the delegate beside them. It moved along the arc. When it reached the Eminence, the chamber had gone so quiet that I could hear the soft sound of the paper being unfolded. The note said, "Our partnership offer remains open. We are available at your convenience." The Eminence held the paper for a long time. Then, very slowly, it set it down on the surface in front of it. I wrote down what First had said in the old ceremonial register, in case anyone ever asked me. The translation was not poetic. It was simple. 40 years I have watched this council speak. Today, for the first time, I have voted. My people have been waiting for someone to open this door. We are grateful to the humans for finding it. That night I ate dinner alone in the station cafeteria, which served a menu that catered to 17 different species and was, for humans, approximately adequate. I had a bowl of something that was mostly grain, a glass of water, and the particular quiet that comes after a long and significant day. My comm chimed. It was Drivos. "I have submitted my resignation," his message said. "I wanted you to know before you heard it from anyone else. I have served the council for 40 years and I have watched it do many things. Today was the first day I watched it do something it did not intend. That is new. I do not know what comes next." Then, after a pause, I was wondering if humanity has room for one more. I wrote back immediately, "Yes. Obviously yes. I have been back on Earth for 6 months now." The Velhari Compact was signed in Geneva on a Tuesday, which is exactly the kind of day the most significant things happen on, an ordinary day, chosen for scheduling reasons, with no particular drama to it. The ceremony was small by diplomatic standards, 30 people in a room with good lighting and a table that someone had clearly polished that morning. First stood beside our Secretary General and they each signed their names in their own language, and the 2 documents were sealed and filed, and then someone brought out a tray of refreshments. I stood at the back of the room and watched it happen, and I thought about the Eminence holding a folded piece of notepaper in a chamber that had been designed to make visitors feel small. The Galactic Council, in the months since Cycle 30, had not issued a new ultimatum. It had also not formally acknowledged the failure of the enforcement vote, which was its prerogative. Council procedure did not require the acknowledgement of internal outcomes. What it had done, quietly and without announcement, was request a series of closed bilateral meetings with Earth's diplomatic corps. The meetings had begun 4 weeks after the vote. They were ongoing. I was not in those meetings. My role had shifted. I was no longer a liaison in an observer slot, I was a full member of the diplomatic team, which came with a different kind of clearance and a different kind of responsibility. I was still learning what the second one meant. Director Cole had asked me to give a public talk at the UN Institute of International and Galactic Affairs. A lecture, technically, though he framed it as a conversation. He wanted me to explain, for an audience that had mostly watched the whole thing on screens, what it had actually been like to be in the room. I was standing outside the building when the invitation came to mind again. Geneva in autumn is a specific kind of beautiful, the lake catching the light in that low-angled way, the mountains still carrying the last of the summer on their upper slopes. A crowd of people was moving past me on the wide path outside the institute, dressed for the cool air, going about their Tuesday with the businesslike efficiency of people who have somewhere to be. A young man stopped next to me. He was holding a tablet that was tuned to the live feed of the Velhari signing ceremony inside. "Were you there?" he asked. "On Argos 7, I mean. You look like the woman from the news coverage." "I was there," I said. He looked at me with the expression people get when they have thought about something for a long time and finally have the chance to ask. "What was it like?" "When they threatened us." I thought about the chamber. The curved walls. The eminence reading charges in its chest-deep voice. The silence that followed the ultimatum, and then the sound that came through from Earth 4 seconds later. "Loud," I said. He laughed, a little uncertainly, not sure if I was joking. "The cheering," I said. "When the threat came through and Earth heard it." The response was immediate. I was standing in a room full of beings who had never been told no, and I had an open comm line to Earth, and what came through was cheering. Not fear. Not planning. Just cheering. "Why?" he asked. It was the same question Owen had asked me, in the corridor outside the chamber on Cycle 1, when we were still figuring out what had happened. I had given Owen an incomplete answer that day. I had said, "I think that's what we do," which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was longer and required more of the context that 6 months of debriefs, meetings, strategic assessments, and one very small ceremony on a Tuesday in Geneva had provided. Because we had been waiting, I said. That's the thing the council never understood. They thought the threat would land like a weight, like something pressing down that we'd have to struggle under. They've delivered that same threat 9 times before, and 9 times that's exactly what it did. It pressed down, and the thing it pressed down on gave way. I paused. But we're not built the same way. We've spent the last 100 years getting pressed down by things much closer to home, things we made ourselves, problems we caused, crises we nearly didn't survive. And every time something pressed down on us, we did not give way. We got interested. We got stubborn. We started working on the problem. And somewhere in all of that, we developed this particular response to big threats, this thing where instead of collapsing, we get loud. The young man was listening carefully. The cheering wasn't because we weren't scared, I said. Some of those people cheering absolutely were scared. I was scared. But the fear didn't win the room. Because underneath the fear was something older and louder, this recognition that the moment had finally arrived. The big one. The one that all the smaller ones had been practiced for. And when humans recognize that kind of moment, we don't go quiet. We cheer. Not at the threat. At the chance. He nodded slowly. And now, he asked. I looked at the lake, and the mountains, and the clear autumn sky. Inside the building behind us, a small signing ceremony was wrapping up. Dreyvos was somewhere in Geneva. He had arrived 3 weeks ago with 2 bags and a formal request for diplomatic residency, and someone from the Foreign Affairs office had taken him to see the Alps, and he had sent me a single message afterward that said, I understand now why you went to the stars. The Eminence had sent a formal request for private consultation with Earth's senior diplomatic team, the first such request in council history, and the meeting was scheduled for next month. The Velhari, the Marin, the Pyarth, the Torval, 4 delegations that had either abstained or opposed the enforcement vote, had each, in their own time and their own way, made contact. Not dramatically. Not with grand declarations. Just contact. The kind of quiet reaching out that happens between species when the thing that was keeping them apart has been shown to be movable. Now, I said, we find out what comes next. The young man nodded once more, satisfied, and walked on. I stood there for another minute, letting the cold air do its useful work of clearing the head, and then I turned and went inside. The galaxy was going to have to get used to us. We had always known it would. We had just been waiting for the galaxy to catch up. And when it finally had, when the threat arrived and the countdown started and the chamber walls leaned in and the universe presented its largest, most serious, most ancient face and said, "We can end you," we had done the only honest thing. We had cheered. Not because we were not afraid. Because we were, and we went anyway. The galaxy would learn what that means. We had been practicing for a very long time.